government in Mexico about their efforts to combat all the drug violence that's going on there.
You know, WikiLeaks stuff is kind of a fascinating thing for me because you thought maybe initially it was just something that would blow over after the first set of stories and then after their fearless leader was apprehended. Now, what you're finding, though, is that you have people in various nations now digging up this kind of story of other nations. So you wonder, are we now going to see a underground form of journalism coming out of places like WikiLeaks that reports the other side of the story? Now, it could be positive and negative. Positive in that you might uncover places where there is corruption or wrongdoing, but maybe negative too, because it becomes a distraction away from things moving forward. Instead of progress, we're always going backwards to look back at what happened in 2008 or what happened in 2006. And to some degree, how much bandwidth does the average American or even news consumer have to deal with so many different news topics coming from so many different directions? You really have to pick and choose your sources. I just think that the WikiLeaks stuff just keeps surviving because it has a stronghold. There are enough people who are plugged into that network.
Yeah, and I think there are two major issues that continue to persist, in my opinion, that have to be addressed. Here, number one, you have, how did this all come to be in the first place? Our information is not being properly secured. Our sensitive information, I should say, is not being properly secured. That's what allowed this to happen in the first place. Number two, you've got to deal with all this instability that WikiLeaks is creating on relationships between countries around the world.
Exactly.
These are sensitive diplomatic relationships that have always enjoyed a certain level of, dare I say, secrecy, or maybe discretion is the better use of a term there, so that you could have open communications with your colleagues and your peers in other countries. You could have relations that, maybe stayed under the radar, but now we have all this coming out into the open, and I think that's going to do more harm than good.
Well, I agree with you. I think this is something we're going to have to be vigilant about. It's apparent that WikiLeaks is becoming more of a watchdog group, but I hope that they focus their energies in the right places.
Well, moving on from WikiLeaks to another scandal, I'd like to talk about Goldman Sachs, because there's a case going on in U.S. District Court in New York right now that involves insider trading, and where
it also involves Indian Americans.
Indian Americans, where allegedly someone on Goldman Sachs' board leaked information to a friend of his about some insider trades or insider actions going on that were planned, and that individual was able to profit from that. I think allegedly $45 million in profits were made.
But let's talk about the names here, because they've become commonplace now in the news media. You've got Rajaratnam, who is actually involved in the court case directly. He was implicated, and he's denied any wrongdoing. And you have Rajat Gupta, who allegedly passed this information over to Rajaratnam so that he could execute these deals, and there was profit. Now, it'll be interesting to see who actually pleads guilty and who pleads innocent, because Rajaratnam has pleaded innocent. But many of the people that he was consorting with have pleaded guilty. So you wonder if there's all kinds of backstage, backdoor dealings that are going on to try to convict these two. It is sad because it is the largest U.S. court case to focus on corruption, and it involves Indian Americans. I mean, no matter how you look at it, it's sensational and yet at the same time disappointing.
Well, and there's another aspect of this in that Goldman Sachs, they went after a former employee a few years ago who allegedly stole some proprietary computer code that was of great importance to them. And the computer code was used to execute high-frequency trades, which can net a lot of money for a company like Goldman Sachs. Well, this former employee joined a competitor. So what did Goldman do? They went out and they got a prosecutor involved, and they said, hey, this guy went out and stole proprietary computer code. It's of such a proprietary nature that it could render our financial markets vulnerable. The feds took it seriously, and this guy was actually prosecuted. He's going to be sentenced this week. But in this case, Goldman is kind of just saying, hey, you know what? Information leaked from a board meeting, some money was made, big deal. It's a really different stance here involving a disclosure of information of a different kind.
Well, our financial times have caused a few changes to be made when it comes to small businesses. or the designation of what is a small business. You know, it used to be the Small Business Administration would designate what constitutes a small business by the amount of money they make. If they made under $7 million, then they were a small business. Well, that $7 million limit is being raised now. It's being raised up to $14 million as a way to help a lot of these small companies get to government contracts. You know, what happens is some of these small companies just simply fall between the cracks. They're small contractors stuck in the worst place to be, slightly too big to receive special treatment, but far too small to compete against major contractors. So this way, by allowing more companies in that fold, maybe those companies will not only be able to win these contracts, but then grow while remaining as a small business. What happens is sometimes these small companies will come in, be under $7 million, but as soon as they land that first big government contract, they go right past their $7 million, and now all of a sudden they're in that no man's land between having to compete with the large guys but not having the resources to do it, or the benefits or special programs that exist for the small business. So this just extends that ceiling, gives them a little bit more room. What's interesting, though, folks, is that this revenue ceiling is not the same rate of increase for all industries.
That's right. The SBA has long had distinctions on what constitutes a small business, depending on what kind of industry you're in. And I think for most of our viewers, computer or information technology is probably the one that's of greatest interest to us in the D.C. area.
But that's the one that only increased by a small amount. That's the interesting point here. It only raised the ceiling from $25 million to $25.5 million. That's only $500,000 more.
Yeah, it really isn't much of an increase if you're in the IT sector. And a lot of these companies are in a real weird place because, as you mentioned, they can grow exponentially while they're in the SBA 8A small business program.
Right.
And they can rapidly get up to 20 million, 25 million pretty quickly. But then once you get to that level, you find yourself competing against the Northrop Grummans of the world,
right,
and all these huge mega government contracting companies. And it's very, very tough for a small company like that to compete.
So by creating these broader categories, they're filling more companies into that bucket, hoping that they can share more of the pie with these smaller companies. But it is not an across-the-board increase for all of them. It depends on the industry you're in.
Yeah, and you know, Asta, the SBA, the Small Business Administration, has long been criticized for a lot of these small business programs. The 8A program, another one that's come under a lot of fire recently is the Alaskan Native program, because that program's full of loopholes that are wide enough that you could drive a truck through. And a good example is a story that recently came out in the Washington Post about a D.C. lawyer who used to represent Alaska Native companies until she realized, hey, this can be more lucrative for me if I actually become involved with an Alaska Native corporation. So she went from earning decent legal fees, consulting fees for working with these companies, advising them how to do business, to actually being in this type of business herself. And she has profited from this big time because she's brought in her friends, her relatives, close associates. They've all netted huge amounts of money in these programs.